being here. I hope everyone was able to see the agenda, which is, I think, pretty limited. The main thing we wanted to do is review the work group summary, and I hope people had a chance to take a look. But it kind of goes through what we've been doing over this last year. And I think that's the main thing that we're kind of going through today. Does that sound right, Suki?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, great. All right. Do you want to walk us through it, Suki, and then we can go from there? Okay.
I'd be happy to. I just want to say it's been a great year for this work group. A lot has happened. We will walk through how this summary describes what all you have done and accomplished. And at any minute, you can stop me as we're going through it for minor changes, big changes, anything you've noticed along the way. We'd be happy to take those changes into consideration. Like, we should be thinking about how you want to present this information and be sure it's doing the job that you want it to do here. So all of these summaries have the same basic format in terms of the headings and subheadings. We've got the co-chairs and membership here listed out. If you notice anything amiss with your title, just let me know and we can go in and change that. All of the work groups have the overview. Again, as Nate said, I'm sure you've all read this, but essentially this talks about what you all set out to do for the past several months, specifically noting that the system's processes are largely invisible to the public they most affect, and the charge for this group to provide that information that is often just unseen, therefore unknown by the public at large, and often by the people who are in these processes too. So we had two primary work products, the pre-DJS process flowchart, as well as the early development of the companion state's attorney flowchart, covering prosecutorial decision points. That is in the process. You'll find that most of this covers the pre-DJS decision flowchart, since there was so much work done on that, and the state's attorney's flowchart is still in development. But again, taken together, what these two tools constitute for the broader public as an education tool, and who it's intended to reach, and how they are intended to use this information. So I'll pause now if there's anything anyone wants to say just about what all you in the high level intended to do and did this year.
I'll chime in, and I, at risk of sounding like a broken record, like, I do think, you know, when we first were looking at the idea of public education and narrative change, I feel like the narrative change in a lot of ways is the part that sits there, and working in philanthropy, I'll say, it's like it's such a common word now, or set of words, narrative change, the importance of narrative change. It comes up, it stops having meaning in some ways. Like, what do we mean by narrative change? So we talk about it so much, but it felt to me like, and I think this group, that one of the achievements that we were really hoping for was to be able to build consensus about how things actually exist in the world now. And if we can agree to those things, then we're starting from the same point when we want to talk about how things should change. What do we want to be different about the system? What's working well, what's not working well? Before we get there, we need to know, how does it actually work? And can we agree on that? Can we understand those things? And that's been a lot of what we've wanted to do. And this idea of, what does it mean to educate the public? It is things striking how much media there is about kids and crime and about the juvenile justice system, and how little of it describes how anything works. How does it actually happen? And I think for our group to say like, well, we want to take that on, like part of the public education is to explain how things actually work as a body that's supposed to be this sort of consensus body providing oversight in a certain extent to the system. It's important for us to be able to describe how the world and how it actually exists. So I appreciate this group for like sort of hanging through that, because I know that that's maybe not the most exciting thing to do when thinking about something like narrative change, but I feel like this is a longer process of getting on the same page. And then we're going to only have more of these things to do as there will be new processes in some ways, not new processes, but new ways of dealing with young people with certain offenses now that we have a new law that has fewer kids being charged as adults automatically. That's going to require also like, well, how does this actually work? What's actually happening to kids in detention? All that kind of stuff is things we're going to need to highlight through this group, I think, in the coming year. So I'm glad we're laying the groundwork with police and prosecutors who in both groups, both the state's attorneys and the law enforcement have been really great partners in this process. So I'm hoping we can keep that up as we go into the next year.
Thank you, Nate. And that's echoed throughout here. So let's talk about these key findings. So the pre-DGS decision process flow chart, this group's central deliverable, as Nate says, it maps these decision points that you typically encounters from start to finish. It explains who it was developed with and the validation process that it went through. And it also talks about two important aspects of this flow chart. First, that it's framed as descriptive of current practice, as Nate just described. It doesn't describe the process as it should work. It describes it as it does work, including this discretionary variation, which we've seen crop up throughout our conversations with law enforcement folks as important to understanding the flow chart. So also, it's a little bit of level setting for the people who are reading it. It's a resource for youth and families, and the attempt to provide a uniform process to explain that this is a process, that there's some variation, but they should expect certain things to happen along the way. Second, the flow chart is positioned as a baseline for future commission analysis, as Nate also alluded to. We start with an understanding of what's happening, and then creates the conditions for identifying where change can happen. And then this gets into our distribution plan. It goes along 3 different processes for distribution. First, it will target those local and state government actors who helped with this development of this flow chart, but as well as all of the partner groups and entities that would benefit from understanding this and having it in hand. There was already discussion with DJS at the table about tacking it on to their flow chart. So we'll start there with these systems actors. We will also go out to youth serving nonprofits, parents, anywhere where youth can be found, and then also finally to schools and educators. So 3-pronged approach to distribution. And then also it describes the other parts of the distribution plan, such as a video or animation to describe this process. There is a brief or a narrative document and a narrative document to go along with it that describes the potential uses across audiences. And that purpose is so that they understand what y'all's purpose is for this tool, to help stabilize interpretation, as it moves across all of these different entities and domains. So that is about the pre-DJS. And then we get into the state's attorney's flowchart, which we started developing in early 2026, along with 3 state's attorneys, including our own Carlotta Woodward, Stephanie Hamilton, and Kelly Mosier. And we're wanting to really see what goes on in the one of the least publicly legible stages in the juvenile justice process. So we've engaged with the state's attorneys to ground the resource and see how discretion actually operates. Again, we're trying to make sure it describes practice as it exists while servicing variation, and introduces this new complexity that the other flowchart does not. Outcomes are shaped by facts, of course, but also by things that are in flux and diversion and relationships between officers and things that are happening in various jurisdictions. And we have that task again of really representing that variation accurately. So I wanted this closes it out by saying that the flowchart is the first phase of a broader effort to map the court process more fully. So while it focuses on prosecutorial decision making, it will go into the courtroom process, and it says future phases will likely examine what happens after that transition from the courtroom. It includes public defenders and after the prosecutorial process, and then looking at the courts and judicial decision making. And so we're really trying to build out a whole process for the juvenile justice system. It'll still be done incrementally. And finally, in this section, across both flowcharts, we're servicing that there's no single dominant narrative about juvenile crime, juvenile justice, that even the system actors agree to. And local law enforcement, prosecutors, defense attorneys identify different misunderstandings as consequential. And sometimes they'll disagree or agree on these things. For instance, these public education materials that might name racial disparities might be more credible to some offices and audiences than others. Others might contest that. But the fact remains that what these do is name what actually happens. And it's up to the audience to determine what that means for them, and how they want to understand these. But the bottom line is that these tools are there to give them that baseline of understanding. And then there are recommendations, and these are broken into the different entities that will take up this flowchart. So for youth and families, one of the clearest things that this flowchart is able to do is to provide them a tool that lets them know, families have access to the flowchart before contact occurs, know what questions to ask, the right questions to ask. They'd find it useful to understanding what's happened, what options might still exist. It'd be useful for those who need to interpret what's happening for families. And it just makes visible something that's emerged. Youth outcomes are shaped by a long series of discretionary decisions made by adults. Then we have law enforcement. Again, one of the most significant findings surface is that there's an uneven distribution of pre-arrest diversion across jurisdictions. Some have multiple programs, some have none. And what this might mean to those jurisdictions. And what it might mean for getting more pre-arrest diversion programs, and how they might approach their partners in that, and building those options out. For schools and educators, again, it gives them a clear framework, clear boundaries. It talks about, for schools with SRO programs, the ability to revisit those to be sure that those contacts are handled, how those contacts are handled in jurisdictions, how counselors and personnel who are usually the first folks to come into contact with students who've come into police attention might handle this, with having that baseline of understanding of how this process works. For community organizations, flowchart offers a validated shared baseline, anchor conversations, particularly for staff, for those who have staff in the community but don't necessarily understand this process. And it also helps them to understand where they could fit into the process and how they might reach out and who they might reach out to, like at DJS, to become a part of their diversion options. And then finally, for media, understanding that news media coverage on high-profile events is often limited, as Nate pointed out, and this flowchart offers this neutral description of decision points. It might help them with how they are presenting these cases in a more data-based way, and how they can help to shape understanding of this process and make it more visible. And then in terms of implementation, we talked about in the development of understanding these decision points, but also understanding that the information here is not backed by available data, and how it would be important to find and to understand the extent of youth diversion and paper referrals. We talked about kind of filling in those boxes as a place as possible next step for this flow chart. And also understanding that pre-arrest diversion is the last point where a young person can exit without a formal record. And really trying to highlight that point, as it is a turning point for many youth. And without that discretion, they could end up with a record. And then finally, looking ahead, moving forward, we will work through the distribution, and we will work through the Attorney General, State's Attorney's flowchart, which is now currently with the association and making its same rounds as the pre-DJS flowchart did with law enforcement. Again, it just talks about what these amount to as entry points, and what this group can look forward to in terms of when they're done, as previously described, in terms of next steps for the continuation of these flowcharts. That's generally it, but if there's any point where anything seemed a little fuzzy, I might have noticed a spot where language could be reduced. It's, fluffy and unnecessary, and maybe we need to streamline a bit. So you might see some of that as we go, but any flags, anything anyone wanted to say at this point about what you've read and heard?
Great job. It's a lot.
Yes, absolutely. Great job, Suki, in helping facilitate us through this process. I just also wanted to add, just one bit of context to Nate's words, in that, we wanted to highlight the full kind of ecosystem of youth who are in the legal system versus people just looking at this as something being solely the responsibility of the Department of Juvenile Services. And what we have been able to illustrate, hopefully clearly, is that there are many touch points, entry points, as well as exit ramps for young people. And in addition to there being, along those entry and exit points, there's a tremendous amount of discretion that could be used by either the police, the state's attorneys, whoever they come in contact with. There's a lot of discretion involved. And then lastly, we have to just follow what the law allows us to do with young people. And so with these narratives, the harmful narratives, just really kind of excites people to try to automatically go to the worst or the most punitive option on the table. And, that's not always possible. And we have to stay within the guidelines and the framework of the law. So hopefully those things kind of come through in this process. And again, it will just help with the overall understanding about, the system as a whole.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric. I'm glad you said that, because I do think that came out early on in this, when we were looking at what would be different ways of thinking of a map. And I know I was showing one that we've sometimes played with of a highway with exit ramps. And I think one thing about this process that's been really clear is that there are a lot of exit ramps. There are a lot of exit ramps built in, and understanding how they're used, when they're used, for whom, how often, that feels like a step that we're not there yet. But it is striking. And I think I appreciated that both our law enforcement partners and the state's attorneys made it clear that one of the narratives that we need to change is the idea that just because a kid comes into police custody means that they're going to be sent to DJS. Just because a kid comes to the state's attorney's office means they will be prosecuted. That's not true. And the data are make it pretty clear that that's not true. And we can see that. But I think saying that out loud, and that there are all kinds of ways that young people can be steered away from the system, which is something we should want whenever possible, I think is something that's really good to say out loud, and good to be able to illustrate how that would work.
Yeah. Any more comments on this draft?
All right. So what's next?
There might be minor changes, as I described. I feel like this is my first time walking through it with people. So I feel like if there are points where I could just skip a paragraph, I might go back and have a second look at whether or not that paragraph is needed. But either way, if there are changes, they will be very minor. What's next is I will continue building out the report. This will go in with the other summaries as they are being finished, and there will be drafted a summary, collective themes section from the cross work group themes that are kind of emerging. But soon enough, you all will receive the full report, and you will see this in context of the full report. This work group will not come back together for a few months. You're off for July and August. You'll have to just pay attention to your emails, please, because we will have a commission meeting in August to vote on the final report. It'll be virtual, but should all be there to give this a thumbs up. But long before that, a couple weeks at least, you will have the full report to review. So just be aware of that. But yeah, we won't come together again until let's see, what's the date for our next meeting? That would be September 28th.
Wow.
Nice,
Okay.
yeah. So I'll see you on August 13th at the commission meeting, but again, it will be virtual. And hopefully you won't have a bunch of emails between now and then for me as usual. So you'll have a time off for me too. So
Awesome.
yeah.
We'll miss
Okay.
your emails, but thank you.
Great work, everybody.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure working with you all on this commission.